No more Sega cards. What? Me worry? It's Segaiden episode 63.
Jack Kennedy was a friend of mine. Senator, you're no Jack Kennedy.
A moment of silence here as we begin this episode with news of the demise of the adorable Sega Card format. With the arrival of Spy vs. Spy, the format is well and truly dead. One assumes this death came about as the result of a harebrained scheme by one of the eponymous spies. Flashed a victory sign as the Sega Card format's angel ascended to the heavens. R.I.P. Sega Card, you were thwarted by ignominious means by a comical Cold War allegory. The Sega Card format never really landed here in the US. Between the latter SG-1000 era and the early Mark III days, Japan received dozens of games using that format. We saw, what, 7? The reality is that the card format didn't really fit Sega's American marketing. Or Tonka's at this point in time, I guess. Sega made a big deal about the ever-growing storage capacity of its cartridges, treating that marketing tagline almost as a subtitle were relevant. Quite a few boxes wore the Mega Cartridge sales point, from Fantasy Zone and Action Fighter to Outrun, one of the rare 2 Mega Cartridges. And Sega would continue pimping their cartridge capacity well into the Genesis era by slapping games like Strider with little display bugs celebrating the ROM size. Meanwhile, the Sega Card was all about compact economy, a cheap, space-saving format, which came with the caveat that the space saving also referred to the volume of data space available. I think it would have been fine if Sega had really leaned into the budget side of things, the way Sony would a decade later when it started selling oddball experimental titles for PlayStation, like Parappa the Rapper, for $40 instead of the usual $60 to $70. But most of the time, Sega cards were $5, maybe $10 cheaper than standard cartridges. And ultimately, the cartridges offered richer gameplay and more expansive content. You'd never see games as meaty as Wonder Boy in Monsterland or Shinobi on a Sega card. And it wasn't tough to do some mental calculus and determine which was the better deal. $30 for a massive adventure that could last for weeks, or $25 for a slight throwaway experience. I guess it wasn't Cold War metaphors that killed the Sega card, after all. Just simple austerity left over from the 1-2 punch of the 70s OPEC crisis and the 80s Reagan recession. The irony here is that this version of Spy vs. Spy absolutely crushes the NES game, which showed up in stores at the same time that this card did. That makes Spy vs. Spy both a meaningful last and a meaningful first. The Master System and NES have largely done their own thing in their own way to this point, and the few titles that have appeared on both systems, like Rambo, had nothing to do with one another. I guess the exception would be Wonder Boy and Adventure Island, the latter of which had only just arrived on NES by the time Spy vs. Spy debuted, nearly 2 years after Master System fans had wrung every last droplet of content from their system's snap-back cap-free take on the game. But Spy vs. Spy, which adapted a 1984 computer game by First Star Software into a streamlined form, hit both consoles in October 1988. And somehow, despite shipping on a parsimonious media format with no access to memory management chips or RAM add-ons, the Master System version of Spy vs. Spy didn't simply look better than the NES game, it contained twice as many maps for players to compete through than on NES. That's not a great look for Kemco, who only included 8 of the game's 16 levels in their NES cart. I guess you could forgive Kemco given that their take on Spy vs. Spy had debuted on Famicom back in 1986, before large format memory mappers had become standard fare on that system, except that Sega's Mark III MyCard release of Spy vs. Spy also happened in 1986. So basically, Kemco blew it. But Sega acquits themselves nicely here, with a crisp, fast-paced adaptation of the Sabotage action classic. Drawing up the fundamentals of the source material, Spy vs. Spy features mandatory split-screen action, whether you play against another human or against the computer. You play as one of the unnamed spies from the Mad Magazine cartoon, white or black, while the other spy makes his way through the same maps attempting to achieve the same ends as your character. Fittingly, for a game based on a comic created by a Cuban political exile whose cartoons revolved around the notion that both sides of the Cold War were equally cruel and pig-headed, Spy vs. Spy's playable characters have no distinguishing traits besides their sprite colors. They can perform the same actions and are equally matched in terms of both direct combat and laying down booby traps. Both spies want the same thing, to collect crucial objectives and escape to the airfield. These items are hidden somewhere in the environment of each level, And once you find them, you need to make your way safely to the door that leads to the airfield, which you can optionally choose to indicate on the in-game map or leave obscured. The action takes place over those 16 stages, which grow in size and complexity as you move toward the endgame. The earliest stages consist of just a few rooms with direct links, while the latter stages take place in vast, sprawling complexes that span multiple floors and contain dead ends aplenty. Each room in Spy vs. Spy features multiple interactive objects, safes, desks, paintings, etc., that you can search freely. These fixtures often contain hidden items. Both spies can set up bombs or other traps to go off when an object is disturbed, which makes the search for your objectives dangerous. You never know when something has been booby-trapped. It's possible to defuse these traps by carrying the appropriate counter item, but you can only carry one of those at a time and have to set aside your mission objectives to carry them, which makes using them a little risky. I mean, you'll lose your items if you die from detonating a bomb while passing through a door, but you can also lose items by setting them aside and allowing the enemy spy to rush by and snatch them up while you're otherwise distracted. It's tricky. Of course, if your opponent grabs your stuff, you can always track them down and beat them up with hand-to-hand combat. It's a bit of a blunt object solution, but all's fair in love and Cold War, I suppose. If you lose a fight or trigger a booby trap without the proper countermeasure in hand, you'll die and spend several seconds out of the action before being reset to your starting position. This allows your rival to putter around the stage unobstructed, which can often make the difference between victory or defeat. Fundamentally, this is the same game as on NES, which in turn was the same game as on Commodore 64. It looks a little better and sounds a little worse, but more importantly, it contains a ton of different stages to play through. Spy vs. Spy isn't much of an experience played solo, honestly, but two people competing together on a single screen where you can track the other's every move while trying to sneak in booby traps without their noticing? That's the good stuff, and a pretty solid send-off for the adorable Sega Card format. I'll miss it, but hey, we'll always have TurboGrafx 16. Goodbye cards, hello tiles. Master System receives the first American console conversion of Brodie Lockard's beloved bastardization of mahjong. It's Shanghai. Sometimes people refer to Shanghai as the solitaire version of mahjong, which is not really true, but I guess it gets the point across. Really, Shanghai is a simple matching game in which players need to match two objects with identical values. Here, those objects happen to take the form of mahjong tiles. This translates into 144 tiles in total, with each individual value appearing on 4 tiles per game. The complexity comes from the fact that you can only match tiles that appear along the edge of the puzzle stack. If a tile is blocked or partially blocked to the left or right by other tiles, it isn't eligible for play. Likewise, if a tile is partially covered by other tiles on a higher level of a stack, you need to clear away the upper level's pieces before you can bring the lower tiles into play. In order to successfully complete a Shanghai puzzle, you need to remove all tiles from play. This is more easily said than done. The inclusion of 4 tiles per value means that, as your advanced math skills will tell you, you little genius you, each value set results in 2 matches. This can lead you into all kinds of trouble if you're not careful. While it can be tempting to clear away obvious matches as you play, you run the risk of locking yourself into scenarios where tiles become locked behind impossible match requirements. For example, the quintessential Shanghai predicament is to end up with 4 deadlocked tiles with 2 alternating face values lined up in a row. The pieces on the left edge and right edge can only match with pieces contained between those outer tiles, making it impossible to perform a match and resulting in a loss. But often you won't even get that far. It's pretty much standard procedure to end up with tiles needed for a match to remain hidden beneath a stack, leaving you with no valid matches available for your playable pieces. So Shanghai requires a combination of strategy and luck. You want to pick away at the pieces on the upper stack in order to reveal all the pieces on the lowest tier of tiles. But at the same time, you need to make an effort to clear away the tiles in the bottom level too, since otherwise you run the risk of creating locked arrangements by leaving that level untouched. The Master System version does offer a small touch of grace to players by giving them the ability to undo their actions multiple times. Maybe you think that's cheating, and that's okay. You don't have to do it, it's an option. If you bumble your way to a dead end, and you will, you can also just replay the current tile stack arrangement. Or you can reshuffle to get a new one. Sega's Shanghai offers a few multiplayer options too, including a tournament mode, but that's not really making the most of the solitaire mahjong concept now, is it? This is a game for you to play alone in a dark room, regretting your tile selections as a grand metaphor for questioning your life choices. The Sega Master System version of Shanghai compares well, visually speaking, to subsequent 8-bit versions that would come along. It makes use of an isometric perspective, which gives a clear sense of the height variances to the current stack. This does come with some downsides. For one thing, the extra pixel space dedicated to showing off the sides of the tiles causes the symbols on the mahjong tile faces to become pretty crowded, which makes some of the character suit tiles tough to parse at a glance. The seasons and dragons can be a little smudgy too. This can slow down visual recognition in a way that really shouldn't be an issue for a Shanghai title on a color screen. It doesn't help that the Master System only had 192 pixels of vertical resolution compared to the 224 or 240 of the NES and later consoles. Another issue is that the raised isometric tiles can make face values on the left side of the stack even more difficult to read due to the angle of the overlap. These are minor annoyances, and overall it's a solid version of an addictive game, but there's always room for improvement, right? Once again, these games did not get any love from the Sega Challenge newsletter. It turns out the real Sega Challenge was giving any promotional consideration whatsoever to anything but big blockbuster titles. Next time on Segaiden, so many blades, you'd think you were a mall ninja.